Hello, my name is Rich Howard, owner of Architectural Builder Supply, and this video is to bring you a closer look at the Bommer number LB4310-350-638. This is a single-acting spring hinge, and admittedly one that I don't sell very often, not in the fact that it's an LB4310. That's incredibly common. It's the 638 part that we don't sell often. A really nice-looking 638 finish, also known as US 5, sometimes known as 609, but this isn't 609. This is antique brass. This is the classic, beautiful antique brass, so popular once upon a time. Hopefully it will make a comeback. We call it 638 and not 609 because of the base material. This is made of steel, is why we call it 638. But if you were to look up other examples, look up US 5, that's very common. US 5 is US 5 is a designation from a very old system by which manufacturers could then standardize what they were calling colors. If you looked in a hardware catalog from 1886, they would have incredibly interesting names for finishes. Colombian bronze. Okay, I have no idea what Colombian bronze looks like. Photography was not a part of the catalog inclusion so that I could see different colors in 1886. So there's really no way to know what Colombian bronze was. Well, in the second half of the 19th century, there was a literal explosion of manufacturers of hardware. And they all had their own beautiful finishes. And it was, I think, part of how they would market their product would be to say, we make, this beautiful antique brass, and they call it Colombian bronze, and no one else has Colombian bronze. So I think the finish could come in terms of, what name do I want to hear for the color of my hardware? So that didn't really help because, what if I needed door hinges and then I needed lock sets? Well, I needed the finishes to match, right? Well, the hinge guy doesn't make Colombian bronze. That's a problem. So at some point I don't know and I've not researched it yet, but for sure around the 1930s, this US system was created. This would be on that list as US 5, and that's how you find it. The Builders Hardware Manufacturers Association, also known as BHMA, would take that definition and go a step further. They would tell us that US 5, or antique brass, can be done in two ways: on steel, and then we're going to call it 638, or on bronze, or on brass, and then we're going to call it 609. They're both antique brass, but one defines the base. They both define the base material. This is 638, which specifically means we know the hinge is made of steel. So let's further dissect the part number. Now, in order to best do that, what we're going to look at is taking that part number and breaking it up. First of all, LB stands for Lube bearing, which is a maintenance-free type of three-knuckle hinge construction from Bommer. They can do their LB is on their single-acting spring hinges, and that's a reference to the way that these intersections between these knuckles are designed. Now, the 4310, all of that conspires to mean everything dimensionally important about the hinge, and there is a link below this video to a document called Template that you'll be able to review all of those dimensions. So the important thing to know about that is, and we need to jump to the next part of the part number, 350. That means that it's 3.5 by 3.5. But you'll see from that template, they're going to give you the location of all of the screw holes for that 3.5 inch or the 4-inch model of that as well. Forgive me, just the 3.5 inch model. The 4-inch model is not listed there whatsoever. So understand, the point I'm trying to make is if it's a hinge with 3 holes, it's 3.5 inch. Would be a good rule of thumb with Bommer. And if it has 4 holes, then you're not looking at a 3.5 inch hinge for sure. So on that template, what also makes it a 4310, in addition to the location of these holes, is the corner is square, and the leaf thickness is also specifically inferred in that part number, which is 96 thousandths of an inch. If we take a look at our caliper, 0.094 is what my caliper tells me. So yeah, 96 thousandths. And that means that it is a residential grade hinge. You're going to see this thinner leaf used on residential installations. It also means that it is a full mortise hinge. You can see from the swag on the hinge leaves there, this area right here, that when I bring the leaves parallel to each other, they're meant to be mortised flush to the edge of the door and frame to give you that standard margin between the two hinges. So if you're dealing with a residential weight square corner, the location of the holes are as defined, which we would call template pattern. It is a standardized pattern for 3.5-inch hinges. Although there are other possibilities of locations of screw holes, so be mindful of that. And you'll want to, if you're replacing hinges, to look at that template first and make sure that the holes are going to be in the right position for what this hinge is going to end up requiring. Okay, so the LB4310 means all of that. Now 350, that does mean it's 3.5-inch tall, and it means that it's 3.5-inch wide. And if you note, I said the height first because that is certainly the first dimension when it comes to hinges. And it matters. This is basically a square hinge. Its height is equal to its width. Well, what if you had a 5 by 4.5 or a 4 by 7? The question becomes, what's the first dimension? What's the width? What's the height? The height is the first dimension in a hinge, and it's important to understand that because you will encounter 4.5 by 4. You will encounter 4.5 by 6. Okay, so 4.5 by 4, 4.5 by 6. The width is smaller than the height. The width is greater than the height. So be mindful of that to get it right. Doesn't really much matter on this spring hinge, I suppose, because I'm not aware of rectangular. Well, that's not true. I'm quite sure there are 4.5 by 4-inch spring hinges. Height's the first dimension. Then moving on, we've talked at length about the 638 part number. Suffice it to say, this hinge is going to be available from Bommer in lots of different finishes. Your brasses, your bronze, your chromes, oil rub bronze, satin, polished. Anything that can be done on steel, Bommer has the ability basically to do. If you want antique nickel, I'm quite sure that they can do it. We just need to get a quote for that sort of finish. Now, let's look at the extended description below this video. This is a full mortise hinge, as we discussed earlier. This is UL listed for fire-rated applications. It is listed, which means that on file at the testing agency, there is paperwork that upon demand can be pulled out and scrutinized. It is also labeled, which means it bears visual evidence of the fact that it is a listed product, which means it is approved for use on fire rated assemblies. Okay. Very important to note that if you have a fire rated door, if you're using spring hinges as the means by which to close the door, did you know that the hinge by code must bear a physical label that indicates that it is a listed and approved product? There are spring hinges out there that do not bear that mark, so be mindful if you're dealing with a fire rated door. Be sure to put a hinge on there that does bear the mark, because that means it's been tested and found in compliance with the test requirements. This is non-handed. You can install it for a left-hand door. You can install it for a right-hand door. Self-lubricating hinge, that's the part of the LB. Easily adjustable spring tension, and we'll get to that. ANSI, templated screw hole pattern, the 4310 is that standardized location on a 3.5-inch hinge. The pivot point aligns with residential butt hinges that are between 0.85 and 0.109 thick, which means you can mix and match this with standard non-spring hinges, provided that the leaf thickness is between that range. Made of steel with square corners, 0.96 gauge, template pattern on the holes with a quantity of 6 holes total. And speaking of holes, screws are included. You will get plenty of screws. This client ordered 2 hinges in this box. You will get machine and wood screws for this. You could bump into 1 3/8 steel frames. Condo buildings on the shore of Lake Michigan, on the north end of the city. Miles of buildings, lots of hollow metal frames were installed in those buildings in the 60s and 70s. Rated for maximum door size of 3.0 by 7.0 when you were doing a fire-rated door. Recommended maximum door weight, 85 pounds would be 2 spring hinges and 1 butt hinge. And if you get over that, use three butt hinges. The link to the replacement tension pin and tension rod is listed down below. For every order that you place, you will certainly get 1 tension rod. And for every hinge that you order, you will certainly get 1 tension pin. There are 2 in this package. That's because this client ordered two hinges. Now, let's get into the installation instructions. Now, there are 3 links down below this video that will allow us to review the template which we've pointed to. Then we have installation instructions and certifications and Hinge selection guide. Let's take a look at the Hinge selection guide. Let me back up. In the extended description below the video, there is a link to the tension pin and the tension rod. Should at some point in the future you need to purchase those separately, you can purchase them from the link as seen there. So the certifications and Hinge selection guide is important because it will tell you the quantity of hinges in the table below based on the door weight. Again, if you're doing a fire-rated door, maximum labeled door size is 3.0/7.0. You can't use spring hinges on a 3.0/8.0 door to make it self-closing in a fire-rated application, or at least you cannot with Bommer hinges. And in fact, I would be tempted to say that that might be in code per NFPA 80. I don't recall. If it becomes a question, let me know and I'll do the research. But 3.0/7.0, I believe, is the maximum size for spring hinges in terms of making a fire-rated door self-closing. You can mix and match, as we had discussed earlier. And you can see how the table changes as the size of the hinge changes along with the maximum weight. So these are grade 1 hinges. They have been tested to at least 1 million cycles. I was speaking to the engineer at Bommer one time. I think he pulled the plug on the hinge testing machine when the hinge hit 4.5 million cycles, just didn't see a reason to keep letting it run. Is basically what the conversation was. Uses for single-acting spring hinge minimizes cost of installing a door closing device on industrial, commercial, institutional, and residential applications. I agree with that statement. Used to convert doors to self-closing in existing buildings, sure. For use in hotels, motels, apartments, dormitories, residences, where doors are required to be self-closing. Always verify local code requirements. There may be local code requirements that disallow spring hinges. I'm not aware of any, but that certainly could be the case. And the fact that Bommer puts that information there tells me that there probably are jurisdictions that do not permit it. Sure, it minimizes cost and can help make life easier, but I'm not a fan of spring hinges, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. Labeled doors, maximum door sizes and number of hinges required is based on limits set forth in NFPA 80. Requires a minimum, that code document requires a minimum of 2 spring hinges on labeled fire door applications, and all LB4300 series hinges are rated for openings up to and including 3 or A label openings. And it might just be a good idea to have all spring hinges because of windy conditions or excessive air pressure. For maximum versatility, use all spring hinges. Okay, we'll talk about that in a moment too. UL listed spring hinges are not available with reverse springs. They can make spring hinges, and where you're going to see that hinge is when someone literally wants the door to stay open until you close it, and then you open the door again and it will stay open. Reverse spring hinges are very commonly used in surface mount applications where you're going to, the door is surface mounted, okay, and when you're going to pull that door open, you want it to close again. You'd need a reverse spring hinge in that condition. That's at rest in a reverse hinge. That's at rest in a standard hinge. So a reverse hinge, that's at rest. Okay, so that's where you would use that. Non-labeled doors, have at it. The sky's the limit. Maximum door width 4 foot. For doors over 7'6" in height, use an additional hinge for every 30 inch of height or fraction thereof. So if you have a 60-inch door, you're going to have 2 hinges. You get over that, if you've got a 61-inch door, you'll have 3. Well, that's not realistic. Let's say that you have a 8-foot door. Well, it's over 7'6", so you need 4 hinges on that door. Now, Let's move to the instructions. Installation instructions. Now, I had said earlier, I'm not a fan of spring hinges, and I don't think that they're the most elegant way to close a door, because they're not. It's a spring that energy is stored into the spring and then released as you let the door close. Not a way to control the door. All this is doing is attempting to close the door, not control it at all. Hydraulic control is, or pneumatic, I suppose, but hydraulic control is what you want over a door, whether it be a surface closer or a floor closer or an overhead concealed closer, because that will allow you to control the door over its different areas of operation. A hydraulic closer has different segments of the 180-degree potential arc of a closer that you will be able to affect control over each of those segmented areas that a closer will attempt to close a door in. That's control. A spring is just let it go and it closes. You'll find that spring hinges will make a door slam. You'll find that spring hinges won't reliably latch a door, or that spring hinges don't have enough stored residual energy in the spring at the very crucial last 10 degree of closing to get the door to properly close and latch. And if you have a fire-rated door, your mandate is the door must be self-closing and it must be self-latching. And I don't believe that spring hinges do that in all instances reliably. Now, you will find applications where, boy, that hinge sure closes that hotel door, yeah, because it slams closed. And then you get into an application where you've got a fire-rated door. Well, what about ADA compliance? Are you going to be able to comply with the minimum force required to open the door? Probably. Are you going to be able to comply with the requirement to slow the door down enough, which isn't very slow? You might have, I think, 2 seconds to get the door from about 80 degree to about 15 degree. I forget, but there is a value like that. And do so in such a way that the door will still reliably close and latch. So be mindful that a spring hinge may not be the best option, and I would argue that it's not. However, I would agree that there are times when there are no other options, and a spring hinge is the way to go. Residential condos, are you going to put hydraulic door closers on all the doors? Maybe. It's unusual. Nowadays you see spring hinges, but a condo building built in 1970 that's got hydraulic closers on all 400 of the units in the building. I can tell you that firsthand. Every door has a hydraulic closer on it. Now, how to set the tension? Well, you're going to get your door hung. Just hang the door. There's no tension set on this. And let's go back to our referred to tension rod and tension pin. When you install this hinge, install the tension collar, you'll notice that this funny collar is here. There's not one down here at all, right? Let's get the end of that tension rod installed so that you can rotate the tension collar clockwise. So I've got it installed over here. I can rotate that clockwise. And as I do, I reveal new additional holes. It's into one of those new additional holes that I will insert my tension pin. That's going to hold tension on the door. Now, if you're putting 2 hinges onto a door that would otherwise have 3, that does have 3 hinges, but 2 of them are spring, middle and bottom. That's where you're going to go. Avoid the top hinge because 70% of the door weight is hung on that top hinge, and because spring hinges are not load-bearing hinges, a lot of the efficiency or the ability of a spring hinge to work will be greatly hampered by the fact that it's just doing most of its work just hanging the door. So put your ball bearing hinge up at the top. You'll set your tension, and then what you'll do is you're going to start to test your door. I would look to put tension on that middle hinge. I'd put some on that bottom hinge as well. Top hinge would be the last place that I would place any. Important to note that if you're going up to 180 degree, only 3 holes of tension. And if you're going only to 90 degree, you can place 4 holes of tension on your spring hinge. If you find that you are at the maximum and you've only used 2 of 3 hinges on your door as spring, yeah, you're going to need to add another spring hinge would be my guess. If you hear any creaking or contorting in the spring, it's too much tension set. The spring will break. They don't under normal use. Bommer tested it to 4.5 million cycles and just stopped because it didn't see the reason to continue. But if you set the tension on 8 holes, yeah, the spring's going to break. So be mindful of that. And if we call Bommer and say their spring broke, they're going to say, you broke it. It didn't break on its own. This is a company that is exceptionally proud of the quality of their product, so we'll need to be mindful to use it within the design characteristics. Now let's talk about what a spring hinge kind of does and why it's a valuable piece of equipment that you can use to your advantage. I think what would be a good application of a spring hinge very often is one that you need to have closing to the door naturally, and you'll very commonly see it installed on the front door of a 3-flat apartment building. Okay, you'll always see those doors self-closing. There's an electric strike, there's an intercom system. The spring hinge is very typically used in those applications, and one thing that you'll probably expect, and I would recommend all spring hinges on a door like that, even though the weight of those doors is generally light. They're metal-clad doors with a steel edge or a wood edge. They have some sort of a insulated foam with a very light gauge steel 6-panel residential type doors on a wood frame. All spring hinges are good there because that sort of application is very appropriate for a spring hinge because the doors are light and you can reliably close them. And all spring hinges because when you have more spring hinges rather than less, you have the ability to approach better control over an item. Okay, the ability to tailor the closing force across more springs rather than less. When I liken a spring hinge to like a tugboat. They don't go very fast, but they can pull a lot of weight, and having multiple spring hinges allows you to store greater amounts of energy at its potential. And then when you close it, the point is, at the closing portion, the critical part where you want to have the door to close and latch, but not slam or slam and bounce back open, you have more residual stored energy at the very end of the closing cycle so that you've got enough ability to, like a tugboat, pull that closed and get it closed and, of course, latched. So that's a good application of that, and that generally works out pretty well. The nice thing about the spring hinge is in the summer you'll have different air conditions passing through that building than you do in the winter. You might have some back windows open and that wind will race through, so as the seasons change, someone can affect change on the amount of stored energy in the spring via the tension rod and the tension pin, naturally. So that would be a good application for such a thing. I gotta tell you, I have seen a lot of finishes from Bommer, and I'm especially proud of this finish. They did a nice job getting an antique brass on there. The last thing I'd like to point out to you would be the Bommer logo, made in the USA. It says right above it, a fact that Bommer is quite proud of, as am I to represent them. If you have any questions on the Bommer LB4310-350-638 single acting spring hinge or any other Bommer product, please feel free to reach out to us. And thank you.